Thanks, Lacey. Well, this is our last Sunday on our series on Daniel. At the start of our series at the end of June, Pastor Carl gave us a great overview of Daniel. And one of the things we learned is that chapters 2 through 7 were written in Aramaic, which was the common language of the world at the time. God was concerned for the whole world, so this section in Daniel was intended for all to understand. Chapter 2 was about King Nebuchadnezzar and a statue and a dream he had about a statue representing 4 kingdoms. And then in chapter 7, which we won't touch on, but there Daniel has a dream about 4 beasts. Both stories conclude with the inbreaking of God's kingdom and that his dominion has no end. This section of Daniel, chapters 2 through 7, speaks to all nations and all languages, and it speaks on the truth about the God of Israel, and it offers all people grace, inviting all to know the living God who reveals mysteries, who delivers us from fiery furnaces and lions, and who brings kings to their knees. Last week, Richard gave us a great overview of the 6 chapters that we have been looking at. These first 6 chapters of Daniel are like a highlight reel of his life, the 60 or 70 years of his life in Babylon and Persia. He was living in exile and working for foreign kingdoms, being faithful to God in so many difficult situations, but knowing that God is sovereign. So in today's story, in chapter 6, is set at the beginning of a new empire. Babylon has been defeated, and the Persian Empire takes over. Darius's conquest of this kingdom leads to his first act of establishing a network of administrators, and Daniel is in the top 3. But once again, Daniel is faced with a daunting decision, one that could lead him to being thrown into a den of lions. Back in 1979, Canadian singer-songwriter Bruce Cockburn wrote a song called "Wondering Where the Lions Are." In this song, the lions are the representation of any challenge or obstacle that we may encounter in life. A couple of the verses go like this. I'm not singing it, by the way. I had a dream about lions at the door. They weren't half as frightening as they were before. But I'm thinking about eternity. Some kind of ecstasy has got a hold of me. Up among the firs where it smells so sweet, or down in the valley where the river used to be, I got my mind on eternity. Some kind of ecstasy has got a hold on me, and I'm wondering where the lions are. I'm wondering where the lions are. At the core of this song is a reflection of finding peace amidst chaos and confusion. It encourages us to embrace hope and not succumb to fear or anxiety. Sometimes there are very real reasons to feel threatened and afraid. We may find ourselves in circumstances over which we have no power or control. When we are betrayed, undermined, have a target on our backs, who will we trust to save us? Are you wondering where the lions are, or are they very evident to you? Do you feel the challenges acutely? Maybe the difficulties are there, but you don't see them as such. You have found peace amidst the chaos. Maybe you have no fear of lions in your life or what they could do. Maybe you're like Daniel. Daniel was firm in his faithfulness to God. His prayer life was consistent. Even the king recognized that Daniel served his God continually and consistently. When we are faithful, we find that we will be made blameless before God. We need not fear the lions. Let's look briefly at chapter 6. The structure of this story begins and ends with Daniel prospering. In the middle, King Darius enacts a decree that can't be revoked. and the story ends with a new decree that supersedes the first. At the beginning of the chapter, we learn that Daniel has distinguished himself so much from others that it leads to the other administrators and satraps, which are the names of the provincial governors in the Persian Empire. They become very jealous. At least that's what we can assume, since it doesn't say exactly why they started to plot against him. They were trying to find a way to get him removed. Maybe it was because they still saw him as an outsider, even though he had been living in Persia for most of his life. Daniel was trustworthy, not corrupt or negligent, probably a really nice guy to hang out with. But they were going to great lengths to get rid of him. Daniel distinguished himself in two ways: his personality and his abilities in administration. He was gifted by God for these things. He was called by God to serve in the king's court to use his gifts. Throughout the story, Daniel distinguishes himself from those who were scheming against him. Early on, they seek ways to discredit him. They scheme and manipulate the king. Their dishonesty is apparent in proposing a decree that will enhance the king's power while destroying Daniel. They care little for truth, for the welfare of the empire, for the king, or even their own laws. Their consuming passion is to dispose of Daniel. Daniel, on the other hand, has a wholesome spirit. He was an excellent administrator, careful with the smallest details. He is blameless before God and has not done anything to harm the king. In verses 6 to 9, we learn that King Darius is easily manipulated with false praise to order a decree that people can pray only to him for 30 days or else be thrown into a den of lions. Then, immediately, following in verse 10, Daniel learns about this new decree and simply goes to pray. Like was his routine, his daily rhythm. He didn't hide it. His whole belief system was being attacked. He doesn't go to the king and argue the injustice of it, though he probably could have, since he was held in such high esteem by him. He goes to his room and prays, and he did what he always did and worshiped God. When the lions are at your door, you do what you always have done. And in Daniel's case, it was to pray, to worship God. What is your fallback when things are difficult, when there are challenges? Now, King Darius is forced by the law to send Daniel to the lion's den. God shuts the mouths of the lions, and Daniel is saved. The king then issues another decree that Daniel's God must be revered, since he is the living God. Of course, ordering people to fear and revere even the living God is misdirected, just like the first decree was. You can't force people to worship or to believe. In this story, as in the earlier ones, humans who claim greatness, power, and authority are confronted by the God to whom the faithful bear witness. As a result, powerful leaders come face to face with the power of Daniel's God. It leads kings to call all their people to tremble and fear before the living God. God's dominion has no end. This chapter then ends with Daniel's recovery of his place of responsibility. It makes the point that it is possible for persons of faith to both survive and to overcome. The living God is at work. Let's take a closer look at the person of Daniel. Now, Daniel was quite old when he served in Darius' kingdom, possibly around 80. He was taken into Babylon exile as a youth. He was chosen to serve in the king's palace because he was from the royal line and was intelligent and handsome. He was forced to study the ways of the Babylonians, which included astrology and literature. He distinguished himself at an early stage of his captivity and was noticed by the king for being unequal in the court. Daniel was probably also very well acquainted with the scriptures from his childhood, and especially the Psalms that were part of the Israelites' daily living, taught by his parents and community according to Deuteronomy chapter 6. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Daniel remained faithful to what he was taught and what he believed from an early age. Removed from all he knew and placed in a foreign land under duress, he remained true to what he believed. He didn't seem to waver in his praying rituals his whole life. He used his gifts and abilities to serve kings so well that others resented him for it. Do you feel at times that you are in a foreign land? Now, of course, for some of you, that is true quite literally. For others of us, we may feel our faith and our culture that we live in, that our children and grandchildren are living in, are so far apart from each other, so foreign. What we believe and how we behave are at times so opposed to the culture we are in. David Fitch writes, "Culture shapes you. Every day our desires, attractions, wants are shaped by the forces of our surrounding culture. I can't shape myself towards the goodness of God by myself. Not possible. Find a culture, a church, that shapes you into the goodness of God in Christ Jesus." Daniel and his people were living in a culture that was foreign, literally and figuratively, and they had been doing it for a long time. At this point in the story, Daniel is quite old, and yet all this time he had not let the culture he lived in and worked in allow him to change his beliefs and even compromise them. All these years in exile, Daniel is still distinguishing himself. He was still serving God fully. He was practicing a long obedience in the same direction. This quote, "a long obedience in the same direction," is from Nietzsche and was used by Eugene Peterson as a title of his book. Discipleship, following Jesus, is a long obedience in the same direction. We make choices every day for or against Jesus. We do this year after year through, at times, some very difficult life events. But the direction we are going in our life and the choices we need to make need to look towards Jesus. We need to turn our eyes to him. Do you fear the lions? And what is your posture when they come at you? How did Daniel do it over all these years? Have you ever caught yourself in a moment of negative self-talk? Maybe you're about to give a presentation and you hear that little voice in your head saying, "You're going to mess this up." Or perhaps you're considering asking someone out on a date, but then you think, "They'd never be interested in someone like me." If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. We all have an internal dialogue running in our minds, and this self-talk can have a profound impact on our lives. Dr. Henry Cloud is an author and psychologist, and he writes that self-talk is essentially the writing in our heads, a complex network of beliefs and mental maps that guide us through life. Just as we have a mental map to navigate from our bedroom to our kitchen, we also have maps for how we think life works. These maps form through our experiences, teachings, and the environments we are exposed to. Your thoughts shape your reality. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we're capable of have a profound impact on our actions and ultimately our outcomes. Studies have shown that optimistic thinkers consistently outperform their more pessimistic counterparts, even when the optimists have less natural talent or ability. I wonder if Daniel was an optimist. I think he was. He faced lions, real and the proverbial lions in all kinds of situations. Maybe Daniel's self-talk included reciting Psalms, like the beginning of Psalm 121. I lift my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not sleep. He will keep you from harm. He will watch over you. Eugene Peterson writes that the promise of the psalm, and both Hebrews and Christians have always read it this way, is not that we shall never stub our toes, but no injury, no illness, no accident, no distress will have an evil power over us. That is, will be able to separate us from God's purpose in us. At no time is there the faintest suggestion in the Bible that the life of faith exempts us from difficulties. And Daniel's story is not about all the difficulties he endured. It's about the God who saves, walks with us, and guides us. He knew this personally. He remembered what God had done before and rehearsed it in his mind daily. He knew there were lions, but he believed in the God who created him and walked with him. Another way I think that Daniel persevered through all those years is that he followed rhythms every day. Steve Wientz wrote a book called Beginnings, and it looks at the days of creation, every day in the creation story. On day 7, he says, we create space for God, so God can tend to our needs, and so we can delight in God and the gifts God has given us. How do we practice Sabbath rest? Is it in the moments or on a set day of the week? What do you need to stop doing so that you can rest? Be replenished and delight in the things that nourish you. What do you need to start doing? Daniel couldn't go to a temple and hear the scriptures read and be with his community, but he could pray 3 times a day, facing Jerusalem, to enjoy those Sabbath moments and delight in God, and so God could tend his needs. Walter Brueggemann wrote a lovely little book called Sabbath as Resistance, saying no to the culture of now. In it, he looks at the 10 Commandments. He says that by observing Sabbath days or moments, we speak against the culture around us that demands that we produce, that we are accomplishing something, that we are worthy only in our doing of things. Brueggemann writes about the Israelites being reminded to not be anxious through many of the Psalms. In these Psalms, we can see the world is an anxiety-free one of well-being because the Creator is anxiety-free and publicly exhibits that freedom from anxiety by not checking things out. God is not a workaholic. God is not Pharaoh. God does not keep jacking up production schedules. To the contrary, God rests, confident, serene, at peace. God's rest, moreover, bestows on us a restfulness that contradicts the drivenness of the systems of Pharaohs. Daniel didn't allow the foreign culture to overwhelm him. He practiced Sabbath keeping. If you are interested, there are several Sabbath idea moments that I have previously shared with families, but it works for all ages. They are 1, 3, and 5 minute long Sabbath ideas, and I've placed them on the Church Life Center. Please help yourself if you want to practice some of these mini Sabbath moments in your week. As we think about Daniel and how he followed God in his long life, we can see that we need rhythms that draw us to God, that stills our minds and hearts. We need to follow Jesus every day, obeying him in the same direction. We need a culture, a community that informs us, that shapes us into the goodness of God in Christ Jesus. We need not be afraid of the lions when they come, for our God is a living God who is for you and is always with you. To God be the glory.